In the name of the Father. And so we often had shows like Law and Order SVU as guests on our campus, which was a very interesting experience. And it also meant that every time I heard this particular gospel story, this parable that Jesus tells this morning in the chapel at seminary, and every time since then, my mind immediately goes to Law and Order, first century Palestine. You see, Jesus tells this parable not because he's watched too many episodes of Law and Order, but because this kind of relationship, this idea of a judge and a plaintiff and evidence, was an important part of everyday life in first century Palestine. It was how you got justice. It was how you made sure that you were taken care of when someone had done something against you. You had to have evidence, and there was no police. You just went before the judge and said, this happened, here's the evidence, give me justice. And what we have in this morning's story that Jesus tells is a widow. And that's an important thing, because widows are not considered nice old ladies in first century Palestine that we have to take care of. Widows, because of the cultural context, were people who weren't particularly well cared for. They didn't have a lot of power, didn't have a lot of ownership of much. And so there was no need on behalf of the judge, no power structure that said you have to take care of this widow because otherwise bad things will happen. It was simply that she kept showing up. She wore him out, Jesus says, with continually coming to him. Now think about this from the widow's perspective, though. Think about this, because this was such a part of life in first century Palestine, going to the gate. That's what it means when you ask for judgment in the gate. Every town had a wall, and you would meet in the gate. You would meet with the elders, who were the judges, to try cases right at the gate of the building. Because if you showed evidence and the person who evidence was given against, who had done the wrong, didn't make restitution, recompense, and all of those things, he was cast out of the town, exiled, ostracized. That was the reason that people would do a deal, as it were, to use the language of Law and Order, because they didn't want to be sent out of the city to fend for themselves in the wild. So in this system, everyone knew who the elders and the judges were. It was almost as if everybody in town was their own Nina Totenberg. Everybody knew the judge had that personal relationship with the judges and could tell the way that the court was going to lean. And so this woman changed the tilt of this judge simply by being persistent. Imagine her life, if you will. She gets up in the morning, she listens to NPR, she makes some coffee, and then she goes down to the gates of the town, goes to the elder and says, "Are you ready to give me justice yet? Give me justice against my accuser, against the one I accuse. Give me justice." And the judge says, "No." And so she goes home. She goes along with her day. And the next day she gets up again, listens to the radio, drinks her coffee, goes down to the gates of the town, looks at the judge and says, "Give me justice." The judge says, "No." She goes about her day. The next day she does it again. Day, after week, after month, after year, again and again and again, until finally the judge, one day she gets there, says, "Give me justice," and the judge throws up his hands and says, "All right, fine, show me your evidence," and grants her justice. Now, importantly, Jesus is not saying that the judge is like God, right? Jesus is doing an if-then parable, much as he does with other parables, such as, who among you, if your child asked for a loaf of bread, would give them a snake? And if your child asked for a fish, would give them a scorpion? If you know how to give your children good things, Jesus says, then how much more does God know how to give you good things? This is in a different gospel. In this gospel, Jesus uses this parable to make the same case. If even an unjust judge will eventually give justice, how much more will God give justice? The judge is almost the antithesis of God. And that's very important and interesting, because this judge, Jesus says several times, has no regard for God or people. The judge is only interested in the law and what the law says. Does not care about people, does not care about God, does not care about equity or inclusion or love or anything like that. But God does. God cares very much about all of those things. In fact, Jesus, many other places in the gospel, says that God's preference is for those who have no power. Not only Jesus says that, but the whole of the Bible over and over again, from Genesis all the way to Revelation, says that God's preference is for the widow, the orphan, the alien in your midst. God's preference is for those who have no power. God's preference is for equity. God's preference is for inclusion. And that for God is justice. That is what justice looks like. And so Jesus holds up this woman, this widow, as a paragon of prayer. But this paragon of prayer is not the kind of prayer that we hear about sometimes, where someone says, I'm going to take it to prayer, and they come back 5 minutes later, okay, I had a word from God. That's not really what Jesus says prayer looks like. Right? Prayer is not easy answers from the God that seems to always agree with what we want. One famous African-American preacher said, until you have stood for years knocking at a locked door, your knuckles bruised and bleeding, you do not really know what prayer is. The woman, the widow that Jesus holds up as the paragon of faithful prayer, of faith itself, is a woman who is persistent and consistent every day, day after day, after week, after month, after year, going back to ask again, to seek justice again. And it leads you to wonder, what's the return on investment? Because we're human. We know that our time is finite. We know that for everything we do, there are 6 other things that we're not doing, that we could be doing. And so it's easy to wonder, what's the return on investment for prayer if it takes years of bruised and bloody knuckles knocking to wait for that door to be opened, to wait for God's time to come in line with our desires? What's the return on investment? Would our time be better spent doing something else? Folding pamphlets, organizing rallies, if justice is what we seek? Would our time be better spent making a podcast, trying to exonerate the innocent? Would our time be better spent doing anything else besides asking for prayer? If we are called to be stewards, to take the time and the resources that God has given us and give them back to God in many and various ways for the betterment of God's people, is prayer something we should invest our time in? And I suppose the answer is only if Jesus did. But here's the thing about Jesus. Jesus looks a little bit different in every one of the Gospels, right? There are 4 of them, told a little different in all of them. Constantly praying. Constantly in prayer. Every day, every night, sometimes all night, sometimes very early in the morning, going up on mountains, down into deserted places, over and over again. One time he even goes out in the wilderness for 40 days to pray. And keep in mind, this is out of 3 years. 3 short years that he has, 36 months that he has of public ministry. And he spends time every single day in prayer. So maybe it is important. Maybe the return on that investment is one that we don't quite understand, that we can't really see. But it is something that we can give. Something that we can be good stewards of. In just a few minutes, there is going to be a baptism, if you hadn't guessed by the candle being out in the front of the service being a little bit short. We're going to have a baptism. And baptism is this interesting sacrament in the church. Most of the sacraments in the church that we practice every holy matrimony, we're given a new life together in God. The sacrament of unction, we are healed. We are healed by God in ways that we do not quite understand, but it happens. And you go down through the sacraments, each one God is doing something for us. But in baptism, in this very first of the sacraments, we are also giving something to God in ourselves. You see, the liturgy says, through the grave and gate of death, by the water of baptism, we are given new life in Jesus in the resurrection, and we are knit together in the body of Christ. And that means that we are giving ourselves to be knit into that body. We are giving ourselves to be dedicated to justice for everyone. We are giving ourselves to be knit into the work of Jesus that is that justice in every moment of our day. And what we are being asked to give is our persistence. That widow gives to justice in Jesus' story this morning, in prayer and action, because prayer is action. The return on investment for saying, hey, Jesus, gimme, might seem small, but that's not all that prayer is. Prayer is everything that we do and say and think as we relate to God and as we seek toward God's kingdom, which looks like the justice that the widow sought, that looks like equity and inclusion for all of God's people. We give through baptism that which has been given to us, ourselves, our souls and bodies, to God, back to God, to do God's work. Just as God gives us life, we give our lives for justice. One of the times that Law & Order SVU came to the campus of my seminary, they were shooting a night scene in Central Park. And it was the scene that happens in every Law & Order episode. You know, the discovery of the body. And this particular one was happening at about 8 o'clock at night on a Monday, which is an interesting choice in a school. And so, for 16 takes, while choir practice was happening in the room just above, so they're shooting the scene down in the garden, in the midst of some bushes, and second story up, right across a sidewalk, is the large choir room where the schola for the chapel is practicing. And so we were trying to run through the service for the next day. And so for 16 takes, as we're trying to sing, we hear, and action, rustle, 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 blood-curdling scream, rustle, 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 cut. 10 minutes later, action, rustle, 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 blood-curdling scream, rustle, 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 cut. And the conductor starts trying to time our rehearsals to these takes, using that 10-minute window between them where they're resetting or changing some lights or whatever they're doing to try and get us to sing in the midst of that, because the actress that is doing the blood-curdling scream is doing a really good job and a really consistent job. That blood-curdling scream is loud and long and blood-curdling every time. And so finally, after the 16th take, the conductor, our church music professor, a lifelong New Yorker, simply turns his head and looks to the window for a long second, and then turns and looks back to all of us and says, "You have to admire her consistency. May we be able to do that same thing tomorrow." There was a widow, Jesus said, who kept going to the judge demanding justice until eventually even that unjust judge was worn down. Justice won. How much more when you seek justice in prayer and action, persistently, insistently, consistency, will God be with you to see that justice done. Amen.